I'm delighted to say that our lunch hours have become very popular, and we have gained many new friends as a result of that. So an indirect benefit of the pandemic, which is of course the subject of our webinar today, the pandemic, which has dominated all our lives for the last 5 months in personal as well as professional ways. Those of you who had attended some of our previous webinars will know that we had covered about a month or so ago, we had considered the effects of the pandemic from the point of view of transport and movement. Today, we will be looking at the effects of the pandemic on city life, but we will be looking at it from 2 different angles, that of planning and also the economics. As always, we have 2 speakers who will both speak for between 10 to 15 minutes each, during which time, please ask whatever questions by using the chat button during their presentations. If you ask your questions, we will be recording them, and then I will be asking you to ask each of the 2 speakers your own question, or I may in fact read your question out myself. So we're going to start by looking at the planning angle of the effects of the pandemic on city life with Katie Davis, who is a chartered planning and development surveyor and is currently a partner at Carter Jonas. Katie specialises in development projects in London and the Southeast, and she has developed strategies for complex developments, leading negotiations around affordable housing, Section 106 issues, and SIL. So, without further ado, I hand you over to Katie.
Afternoon all. Thank you, Andreas. Hope you can all hear me well. I hope everyone's doing well during these interesting times. Apologies firstly for my slightly doomsday scary looking first slide. I think I probably need to lighten things up a bit and kick off my segment. I'm actually going to steal a piece from a BBC article I read a few weeks ago. Have the first slide, please. It's entitled, "This is what coronavirus will do to our offices and homes." And it reads a bit like a story. So here we go. Meet Laila. It's the year 2025 and she works from home 4 days a week. It's been that way since the 2020 lockdown. Laila arrives at her office building at 7 a.m. Start times at the company where she works are staggered to minimise the number of people arriving at the same time. Her office days are mainly for meetings. Gone are the days when she'd head into the office to work at a screen. She can do that at home. Laila's employer used to share a much larger office with several other companies. Now they're in a smaller, newly refurbished premises all to themselves. On the ground floor, Laila pauses in front of a thermal body scanner to check her temperature is normal. A camera, used for facial recognition, identifies her as a staff member, and a security barrier opens. At no point does she touch anything. Laila is on a contactless pathway. The lift to her office on the 4th floor is voice activated. The maximum occupancy is 2. On the 4th floor, she walks down the corridor and through the door. Both are wider than before, made that way to keep staff further apart. Laila's office used to be completely open plan. Now she's partitioned off. To her left, there is a clear plastic screen so that she can at least see her colleagues. The screens are removable, bolted into fixtures in the floor. They go up if there's a threat of an outbreak, but come out if the threat subsides. Laila's morning is spent in a meeting about a new project. It's face-to-face with colleagues, but all at a safe distance. The only reason Laila goes into the office now is for this kind of interaction, in which meeting people in real life produces better results than meeting each other online. It's 4 o'clock and time to go home. Laila moved to the suburbs with a friend after the lockdown in 2020. It's a longer commute, but she doesn't mind as it's only once a week. A bigger home meant more space. When the lockdown came, she thought working from home would only last a few weeks, and that she'd managed with a laptop on the kitchen table. But when weeks turned into months and months turned into years, she knew she would need a home office, and her old flat in town was nowhere near big enough. Now, I don't know about you, but I find that all a bit sterile, a bit depressing, to think that in 5 years' time, we still can't really interact with others, that all the big offices will be defunct and will have all flocked to the suburbs like in the post-war decades. Like life is still on pause. Now, my assumption is that Laila is living in a no-vaccine world, and I hope for all our sakes, Laila included, that there is a vaccine. Next slide, please. Thank you. So without a doubt, coronavirus has had a dramatic effect on the way we go about our lives, particularly in cities. Whilst I can't predict the future, I'd like to say that city life will be able to return to some form of normality, with trips to the theatre, nights out in bars, schools functioning as schools should, tourist visits, hotel stays, meetings in offices, and shopping on high streets. I do think it will be, and it should be, a new normal, with lessons learned from this period. And we've all read it. There's so much hype in the media about the death of the office and a move away from shared living at a time when build to rent, co-living, co-working, was all starting to be all the rage. Personally, I can't picture Canary Wharf as an American ghost town with tumbleweed, or the majority of the population living in big houses with nice big gardens. For starters, many people won't be able to afford to move house or spend money on home improvements. We're in a recession, and many employers won't have the money to relocate or renegotiate their lease. And I think fundamentally, as many of us know, it can take years to design, get planning for, finance, or construct these supposed post-COVID buildings. And if there's anything I've learned from lockdown, so I don't think we can generalise. We should keep an open mind on the matter. Everyone's circumstances are different. We can't be certain of the future, or the timings for when the pandemic might be something of the past. Next slide, please. If we really think about it, COVID-19 hasn't really produced anything new. It's just dramatically accelerating existing trends, such as working from home, walking and cycling, e-commerce. These have been affecting global cities for years. It's just happening a lot quicker than I think anybody could have predicted because of COVID. And the impact on these trends will be to erode the demand for, and thus the value of, certain assets in our cities, such as office buildings, retail units. But this was beginning to happen already. I think what needs to be understood is the extent of the shifts in behaviour that we're talking about, the better work-life balance that some of us have been exposed to, and how our cities need to adapt potentially to this new way of living and working. So I think what's certainly emerging is this hybrid model of working that you're often hearing about, particularly for the part of the population who traditionally may have worked 5 days a week in the office. People have learned that they can work from home. They can be productive, maybe even more productive than previously. But what I think is a few months down the line, certainly for me, is that we are missing certain things about the office as well. It's the social interactions, the human contact, collaboration, mentoring, being mentored, or even just being in a place where you can focus away from home life, from childcare responsibilities, or even just that pile of washing that's accumulated on the floor. Coming together in the real world is still fundamental to human psychology. We are social beings after all, and you cannot replicate some of those nuances and connections on a Zoom or a Teams call. I don't even know if you're even listening and I can't see you. We all know what I mean. I think there's no doubt that technology now means that we do not need as much office space as previously, and technology will be key to this transition. I think it would be wrong to think that our cities are all about offices. Equally, I think it would be wrong to think that the majority of people can now work from home, as that totally neglects those in manufacturing and logistics, services, the hospitality, nighttime economy. And a considerable number of those have been affected and will continue to be by these office workers facing themselves at home. From the delivery drivers who've never been busier to the sandwich shop owner in the centre of town who's lost his weekday lunchtime trade. So whilst I do think for some there will be this new hybrid way of working, I don't believe people want to see a hybrid way of living. You know, they'll still want our cities to function in the way that they can enjoy and visit just as they did pre-COVID. Next slide. Thanks. So what can our government and us as practitioners do to help shape our cities post-COVID, and what challenges do we face? Well, if our homes are going to become our place of work, then we need to be building more homes in our cities. You know, cities will always be a draw, you know, particularly for the young population, just as they have been for centuries. That isn't going to change. And with new homes, we need more affordable homes, we need homes for key workers, homes for sharers, homes for small households, for families. You know, we do need to see densification of our cities, more apartment blocks, more mansion blocks. And with this, the need for well-designed public space, public squares, play space, you know, trees, biodiversity, clever outdoor space with Wi-Fi access where people can sit and log on, charge their phones, you know, outdoor gyms. You go to Spain and you can guarantee there is a play area right in the centre of the city, possibly next to some major landmark or heritage asset. You know, outdoor gym equipment along main thoroughfares where apartment dwellers, you know, they make good use of it. I think we can learn a lot from our European counterparts. We need to make our high streets more flexible. The introduction of Use Class E was probably a surprise to most. I don't think our industry has even begun to understand what this could mean. You know, the fact that an office is now in the same asset class as a gym or a shop. You know, will retail and office agents be a thing of the past? You know, what happens to the way we value these spaces, ratings? You know, these are all subjects that go beyond my knowledge, but it's an interesting initiative and hopefully one that can reduce vacancy rates and diversify the vitality and viability of our cities. We need to keep one eye on sustainability. I think I said I wouldn't generalise, but you know, it's very clear that if you live in a city, you have a smaller carbon footprint than someone living in a rural area. You know, it's a fact that apartment buildings use less energy than houses, and city dwellers are more likely to walk, to cycle, use public transport. So in order for our government to achieve the zero net carbon, you know, emissions targets that they're committed to, cities are going to be an essential component in achieving these goals. Next slide. So I'll finish off, and most of you will be aware that the government has recently published papers that look to reform our planning system in an unprecedented way. I think anyone who's actually looked at the white paper, you may have noticed that it's all about housing. You know, every photograph is of a housing scheme. You can't help but think that they've somewhat forgotten about all the other sectors in our economy and workplaces and our high streets, particularly as they're suffering so much at the moment. But perhaps it's the government's way of saying that the market itself will work out what happens to our places of work, you know, where we shop, the demand for, the supply of, etc. And it's actually where we live and how we travel about that's the most important matter to resolve our housing crisis and in turn the COVID crisis. Now, ultimately, I think the legacy of COVID-19 for our cities will come down to choice. You know, during lockdown, we had no choice. It was stay at home, don't see anyone. As we emerge from this crisis, I think it's about the fact businesses, employers, employees, you know, homeowners will have the potential long-term to make more choices, you know, to work in to live in a place that offers them a good balance, you know, and shop how we might want to shop. I think it's just a bit of a shame that it's taken a pandemic for us to realise that. Thank you for listening.
Katie, thank you so much. That was a fantastic summary, really, of the challenges. And also, I was pleased to know the very optimistic message about the future of the cities coming from you. Let's see if our second speaker will agree with that optimistic approach. And the second speaker is a distinguished transport economist. I hope John doesn't mind me saying that. I had the pleasure of working with John for many years at Colin Buchanan and Partners. He is currently Director of Economics and Global Technology Head at Jacobs. and he's also chair of the Transport Economics, Finance and Appraisal Committee of the European Transport Conference. So it is my great pleasure to now give the floor to John Siraut.
Thanks, Andreas. And in many ways, I'm will echo many of the comments that Katie was talking about. So unusually, we may have two speakers agreeing with each other. So if we move on to the next slide, I think, as Katie was saying, the situation we're in at the moment is generally just an acceleration of a previous trend. And what we're seeing is the changing nature of cities and what's occurring in cities, and the cities having to adapt much quicker than they were before. So this is a picture of Manchester, previously a nice busy city centre, and during lockdown completely deserted. If we move on to the next slide. What we're seeing at the moment is changing travel patterns as a result of COVID-19, changes in modes of transport that people are using, and that has implications for our cities. So the top line shows a massive increase in cycling, but if you drill down into those numbers, actually most of that activity is taking place at weekends. It's more leisure. It's not really people shifting from one mode of transport to another. The middle three lines show the use of both goods vehicles and cars. Goods vehicles have been back to normal levels for the last month or so. Car level is almost back to normal. It's about 20% less than the usual at the present moment in time. But it's the bottom line which I think gives most concern is public transport. So bus use is still only around 40% of its normal level. And if we can't get large numbers of people into our cities, and most of our cities are heavily dependent on public transport, then there's a question mark about how those cities are going to adapt going forward. If we move on to the next slide. And what we're seeing is that if you actually drill down into what's happening by time of day, you get a situation which is becoming very apparent. The bottom grey line is showing sort of nighttime traffic levels. And that's been badly hit by the effectively closing down of the evening economy, which is still pretty closed down at the moment. The other line, which is below normal, is the yellow line, which is morning peak traffic. And as Katie's highlighted, a lot of people are still working from home. Obviously, the schools are still out at the moment, but we're seeing that during the day, traffic levels are almost back to normal, but it's that morning commute where traffic levels are a lot lower. So move on to the next one, slide, please. And some of these trends that we are seeing exacerbated or accelerated by COVID-19 have been in existence for a very long time. So UK cinema box office takings peaked in 2007, and they're now down by almost a half, and that's even before the pandemic hit. So we're seeing changes in people's behavior. Well, next slide. And the reason for that is not surprisingly things like Netflix. So Netflix subscriptions were growing rapidly for the last few years. The red line there shows you the massive acceleration that occurred due to COVID-19 as people moved into online subscription services to keep themselves amused. And the question is, are they going to go back to real life cinemas, or actually are they going to stay at home and watch the latest movies at home rather than going out? And that applies to other leisure activities as well. Moving on to the next slide. Again, even before the pandemic, we'd seen a number of casual dining establishments closing down under a lot of pressure. Just Eat is just one of the home delivery operators. Back in the first half of 2019, 65 million orders. That works out roughly as 6 orders per household per year from just this one operator. And interestingly enough, if you look at Just Eat's figures across Europe, the increase in the UK in the first half of the year is less than elsewhere because it's already so entrenched home delivery services. So what we're seeing is that people are not eating out as much, they're actually having food delivered to their home. And the concern to the restaurant trade is the fact that it's the sort of third line down, which shows gross merchandise value, which has increased much faster than the increase in orders, which means people are actually ordering higher quality meals now than they were before, which means, again, the sort of higher end restaurants are also moving into home delivery. And will people go back to using their restaurants in the high street? Next slide. And this is the one that I always amazed actually that people still haven't really twigged what's happening on the retail sector. So the top line there, the sort of orange line, shows these are 12-month moving averages to take out the Christmas seasonality. But it shows that retail sales for around 7 years, since 2013 until the present pandemic, were steadily increasing year on year. But the bottom line is the blue line is sales through bricks and mortar outlets. And that has been static for the last 6-7 years and is below the level it was over a decade ago. What we've done is we've moved over to online retail, which is the grey line, which started off at the bottom left and is now moving up to the top right. And during the pandemic, over 25% of retail sales have been online. And the latest retail figures that came out today showed that retail spend in July 2020 was actually above July 2019, but bricks and mortar retail spend was 10% below the level it was a year ago. And we've seen the massacre of high street stores taking place due to the COVID situation. But in fact, it's just an exacerbation of what's been happening for a very long period of time, that retail has moved online, which raises question marks about the future of retail centres. Moving on to the next slide. Again, as Katie mentioned, there was already a tendency to work from home. What this graph shows is the blue bar shows the average Monday to Thursday situation for travel on the rail network, and the other 3 bars for the other days of the week. So if you look at the early and the morning peak traffic levels, you see, and these are pre-COVID, you see on Friday mornings, a number of people traveling by train, mainly to work at those time of mornings, around 10 to 15% less than they are on a Monday to Thursday. As we move for the day, then Friday traffic picks up, and late evening, not surprisingly, Friday and Saturday traffic is around 50% higher than it is on a Monday to Thursday. But again, what we've seen is that collapse of the evening economy, and that activity has also disappeared. Moving on to the next slide, please. And many of us are working from home, and there's some interesting figures here. So the orange color to the right shows the proportion of people who usually work from home pre-COVID. And you'll see that London was actually quite a small proportion compared to other regions of the UK. So the East Midlands probably had at least more than twice as many people as London working from home. But due to the nature of the types of jobs that are in London, which is replicated in most cities, huge numbers of those jobs can actually be based in offices, and they're the ones that have moved to being working from home. So we've seen that in London, almost 60% of the workforce has been working from home, and in those office-based jobs, they are up to sort of 70%. And the importance for city centres is if those people don't come back to the city centres, again, as sort of Katie mentioned, the sandwich bars, the drinks establishments, a lot of the retail activities in those city centres are underpinned by that huge number of office workers coming through, spending their money. If they're not spending money in their city centres, then those establishments can't survive either. And you get this vicious cycle, downward spiral of economic activity within city centres. So moving on to the next slide. What we're also seeing is this situation where, on the one hand, we've increased traffic levels back to sort of normal levels. On the other hand, we're now taking space away from cars, trying to provide more space for people to walk and cycle. And that has implications again for activities within the city centres. So the example here on the right means that deliveries are now extremely difficult to these shop outlets. There's also severance from the other side of the road where the residential is based. So again, the challenges being faced by many of these businesses is extremely difficult at the present moment in time. Moving on to the next one, please. What we've also seen is a number of cities around the world providing additional outdoor space. Again, as Katie was talking about, how do you increase outdoor activity? In these particular examples, they're providing spaces to restaurants to enable them to provide social distancing and provide some sort of economic activity and some sort of life and buzz back to those city centres. Moving on to the next slide. And this raises the questions really about where we're going in the future. And again, sort of following on many from Katie's comments, what we're seeing is a number of changes of use. The area where we've got a shortage is housing. So residential is where the pressure is on. And at the moment, the implication seems to be we've got surplus capacity in other types of space. So the top picture is of a disused retail mall type operation. Those types of things are now changing over to warehouse space for online distribution for people who are shopping at home. The bottom are showing different examples of retail units which have gone residential. The middle sector is where we're getting more and more restaurants having dark restaurants. That is, they are just now providing for online deliveries. There is no need to have a high street presence. They're put in the back of industrial estates, etc., where your takeaways are now being cooked. And we've seen already in many parts of the UK, and maybe a trend which is going to accelerate going forward, is that we're seeing offices being converted into residential use. And that way, potentially, is we're going to increase the number of people living within our city centres, and at the same time, we're taking out office space. So we see a changing state of our cities. Moving on to the next slide, please. And again, going back to my home city of Manchester, I think that the message, again, echoing Katie's comments really, is that cities have survived many challenges, here even in the case of Manchester over the last 60 to 70 years. But we've seen cities reinvent themselves, repurpose themselves, continue to attract and to grow. And despite what's happening at the moment, I think that's going to continue for a long period of time to come. We will still have cities and they will still be extremely successful and economic centres. And that sums up what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. So another positive message from John as well. So that cheers me up anyway. We've got a number of questions from the audience, but I'm going to use the chair's prerogative and ask the first question. So my question goes to Katie. Katie, you used a very interesting term, which is the post-COVID buildings. I wondered what you meant by that, and whether by that you meant the architecture and the space within the provision of different buildings will change as a result of COVID, i.e. would the new housing model incorporate a study where there was none before? So that's the architecture of residential buildings. And also, I suppose it affects the architecture of office buildings as well. Will that space also change? So I'm just referring to your post-COVID buildings and wondering exactly what you meant by that.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, I started with a little story about Laila. I mean, she's there in what's understood to be a refurbished premises with wider doors, with very small lifts, maximum occupancy 2, lots of technology, so ways to enter without touching any doors or lift buttons, etc., voice activation. I think in terms of offices, there's this sort of vision that maybe we're going to make our buildings smarter.
Yes.
Whether there's a vaccine or not, whether there's another pandemic or not, or this continues, I think the idea being that we can adapt our buildings. I think it's just the fact that, is that going to happen immediately? As we all know, these things take time. I think in terms of our homes, I think if you talk to any of the planning officers at the moment, they are inundated with people who are doing home improvements. People building an office in their garden, or someone who wants to do a loft extension so they can have a home office up in the loft. People who are doing taking down trees so they can create space in the garden. They are busier than ever because people are realising that they potentially need to adapt their home, because working off a laptop in the kitchen isn't going to work long term. And if potentially they are going to have this hybrid way of sometimes going to the office, sometimes being at home, they may well need to adapt their houses. So I think how we design for homes looking forward, I think the flexible working, the study space, we always talk about how many bedrooms there are, and then this big open plan kitchen living space. There may be a return to the small box room, whether it's a nursery or a study. So I think the design of that, I think, is a positive, but equally I don't think we should be scared that it's just all about the virus. I think it's about understanding that these sorts of trends are happening anyway, and we should start thinking now in terms about how our buildings should be in sort of 5 years' time, etc.
Okay, thank you very much. In fact, you mentioned Laila again, and there is a question about Laila from Martina Juvara. Martina, can I ask you to come in, please?
Yes, let me just... yes, I think, thank you, Andreas and John and Katie. It's really good to have these reflections and also all the data, John, you provided. The fear, of course, the acceleration of trends is a key problem, and or is a key thing that we are seeing. But the fear I have is that by assuming that this would be sort of like a constant future, there will not be any other shift. We are encouraging, you know, we are making Laila happen rather than she will happen at all cost. I'm just back from Italy, where there is I've been to a smaller town that was a sleepy town, was a classic place of grandmother and child holiday. The place is reborn. A lot of the old businesses have closed in the past 6 months. New ones have opened. Everybody looks younger. There is a sense, everything is more spacious. The public spaces, you know, the main roads are closed a little bit more often. So there are some trends that were there before. The younger people taking up businesses, younger people, as also Katie said, being attracted to living in cities. Quality of life over salary, or other trends were also happening before. We should also look at those and try to encourage those, just as well as considering that shopping will only be online forever. I never spent so much time in shops as I did last couple of weeks, just the pleasure of being out. I'm not sure, I'm not a shopping person, so I'm sure I will be going back to internet shopping at the same time, but still, that pleasure of being out or having a chat, I don't know, there is also something else, some other trends that we should look at, rather than just the ones of we are only gonna be online and we are only gonna be in the loft or in an adapted room.
Excellent point, Martina, and a lot of passion for life there, just as exactly what I would expect from an Italian. But the gauntlet has been thrown at you, Katie. We shouldn't talk too much about Laila, because we run the risk of making that happen, and there are other trends that we could look at and focus on in order to change things the way we would like them to, rather than the way we predict, so to speak. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think actually probably the last few months have given people time to think about what's important to them, you know, in terms of who the important people that they've been with or who they haven't seen, you know, how best you spend your time, you know, what you do in terms of whether it's exercise, fresh air, you know, a hobby. I think some people have had the luxury of time, whether sadly it's because they've been furloughed or because they live in a situation where they haven't got a large household, or they're trying to juggle childcare and working. I think people have thought about their priorities. And I think what we need to do as practitioners is almost capture that. You know, what have people learned from this period? We're certainly in our office doing a bit of a survey with the team as to, let's not talk about the negatives anymore. Let's talk about the positives that we've had from this period and try and factor that. And I think you're right. I think that it's not just all about e-commerce and potentially the modes that we travel. I think potentially there's other things about what we actually want out of our cities, what we want out of life, what we enjoy, and how we can actually design our places to capture that. So I think it's important, as you say, to bear in mind that everyone has, as I've said, a different personal experience, there's different circumstances. It's easy to generalise about how this period has affected everybody. But I think actually if we took a moment to understand what people's experiences have been like, we can then factor that into our schemes and our designs and policy going forward.
Thank you, Katie. Can I bring in Jeff Haslam now? Jeff is lucky enough to be in New South Wales at the moment, and he has a question about cycling.
I have to point out straight away that the background here is not actually in New South Wales, it's on Zoom, and I'm actually, it's the middle of the night here. I'm staying locked down in a rural part of New South Wales. The nearest town is relatively small, and in Australia, everyone drives cars, and you very rarely see bicycles used apart from recreation, mostly off-road. So I'm not really got my finger on the pulse of what's happening in the UK cycling-wise, but as a keen cyclist myself, I have noticed anecdotally a big increase in cycle use up until I came here in January. And I'm just wondering, from the graph John showed, it looked like cycling hadn't risen remarkably as a result of the pandemic, which quite surprised me. But it seems to be one of those things that can at long last be accommodated in the way that we reorder roads. And I think the case has been made for having less cars on the road, and the general public are beginning to realize that that might be the way forward.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. So, John, what's your view on that?
I think this is a sort of difficult situation where the reality is that many people who cycle previously used public transport, and what we've seen is one of the most successful public transport marketing campaigns ever. The only problem is it's got people off using public transport. And so we haven't seen a reduction in road traffic really. Some of those graphs showed we're back to normal levels with road transport. Cycling took off in a big way during lockdown because there was very little road traffic around. As soon as that traffic has come back, people have got off their bikes. And as I said, a lot of that cycling is for leisure. So there has been some cities have been bolder than others around the world and put in additional cycling provision, and that's been reasonably well used. And I think that the question is, the challenge is for many cities is, are you trying to use this situation to reinvent themselves and repurpose themselves, especially in terms of transport? Or are you trying to go back to life as normal as quickly as possible, and therefore over providing for cars and allowing cars to come back in again in a big way? So I think that's the challenge that different cities have risen to in different ways. Some have gone to say, yeah, there's an opportunity to increase cycling, or as I said, try and get our economies back together again as quickly as possible and let road traffic back in.
So do you think that the government was too hasty, the British government anyway, in setting up this special fund for councils to reclaim space from roads and give it to cycling, for example? Was that too hasty, and is that something that's not going to continue in the future?
I don't think it's too hasty, and I think it's something that, is welcome. I think it's a case of whether, the political pressures and other pressures that many local governments are under, whether it's something they can actually deliver, or whether the pressure is on them to actually allow the cars back in, especially as people have been told not to use public transport until recently. So that's the challenge that, local authorities and cities face.
Yeah. Okay. Can I bring in, I think, is it Andrew Barrell? And that's it. Yes, Andrew, you had a question about John's statistics. Would you like to ask your question?
Well, thank you, Andreas. It was very simply that there was a great drop-off in the amount of travel on a Friday, and I was simply asking, was that a London-based set of statistics, or does that apply across the UK?
So it's a figure that applies across the UK. So that set of statistics is actually for London, but other data for other cities. I've seen data for Sheffield and Manchester, and they show a similar pattern. So a big reduction, or relatively large reduction on Friday commuter type traffic, which is replaced by sort of evening type traffic instead. But there's this move to sort of 4-day-a-week working that was happening pre-COVID.
Staying with your statistics, John, obviously there's been a sharp reduction in the use of rail and buses. Do you see that ever changing again? And what will make people go back on a train again, or use buses more frequently?
So I think this is the massive challenge. There's sort of two things here. One is that we've seen a massive decline in commuter traffic because of people still working from home. So the UK is a bit unusual compared to other European countries where people have gone back into work more than they have in the UK. And so we've seen a decline in commuter traffic. We've also, though, seen a steady increase in leisure type traffic. So that traffic is coming back. We've seen pictures of trains, rams packed, going to Bournemouth, for example, in the hot weather that we had a few weeks ago. So people are happy in some respects to get on public transport. As I say, a lot of it is driven by what they're doing for work. A lot will happen when the schools start going back. More children will be obviously travelling. Parents who had childcare responsibilities may be able to go back to work as well. So I think we'll have to wait really till September to have a better understanding about how public transport is going to change. And there's already talks of having similar campaigns that we have for restaurants, eat out to help out. Potential future campaigns are go out to help out, to get people back on public transport, to get people travelling again. So we'll have to wait and see, I think, till September before we see what's really happening on the transport side.
Okay, thank you. The next question is very different. It's about disability. Can I ask Jazz Adwal to ask your questions, please?
Yes, I found the presentations fascinating and really kind of useful to think about how our city centres particularly might change, but also actual building use as well, and refurbing old buildings or possibly designing new. And I just wondered how that might impact on people with disabilities. I was using the example of the lift for, maximum of 2 people, and somebody in a wheelchair, that may not allow another person in the lift, but also, they have carers that may be accompanying them and so on. And I just wondered whether there was any thought around that, and also in terms of actually navigating new streets, as John was showing in some of his slides, with lots of bollards and railings kind of going up and so on, and the seating outside of restaurants. That's, if I call it street clutter that wasn't there before, and finding people navigating those. Is there a way that we should be pushing more inclusive design, I guess, and using this as the opportunity to do that?
I'm happy to kick off a response there. Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And I think there's a real danger that we're going to go backwards a step here, because I think there have been significant moves in the recent years to ensure that our public realm is free of street clutter, that they are legible routes that are very, very clear in terms of requirements on buildings to be DDA compliant. And I think obviously at the moment we've got this knee-jerk reaction to how do we improve our spaces, but we have to be careful that these don't stay like this for a period longer term. I mean, speaking personally, my mum's partially deaf, and she finds it very, very difficult because she's normally used to lip reading and people with masks. It's absolutely transformed the way she sort of goes about her life over the last few months. I don't think she quite realised just how difficult it was going to be and how long it could stay that way. I think in terms of movement, I think equally, yes, you're right. People now trying to navigate streets where we're trying to encourage people to be outdoors, but does it in fact get in the way of their free flow of movement? I think we need to take on board all these, again, reflect think about actually lots of different disadvantaged groups and make sure that we're not actually going to go full circle and make mistakes like we did some years ago, and go back on what we've been doing to improve our spaces and our buildings to take on board people with lots of different requirements.
Thank you, Katie. John, do you want to add anything to that?
I think Katie covered it.
Yeah. Okay, good. Can I then go back to something that I think both of you mentioned, the collapse of the evening economy. And I couldn't see from anything that you've both said how that will come back. Is that your own view as well? And are the evenings in a city going to be completely different in the future? At the moment, they are buzzing and they are very lively, full of life, etc., etc. Are we going to see darkened cities in the future?
I hope not. Sorry, John, you go.
No, after you.
Thank you. Again, cities will continue to thrive, and in fact, taking great measures to ensure that our cities are more 24-hour cities, just like they are in America and across on the continent. And so I think in terms of, all-night public transport and lots of different uses that could stay open later, I think it will just come down to that point about flexibility and choice. I think if we are able to make better use of other spaces, there will be new ideas that come forward. I mean, America has seen the drive-in cinema for decades, and it's something that now you can actually find them in the UK because people are trying to think of innovative ways to get people out to be enjoying the nighttime economy, but in the safety at the moment of their own space. And so whether we start to see more opportunities coming through of reusing existing space that may become surplus, or new types of initiatives, no doubt there'll be lots of businesses and startups who want to actually take advantage of this move to outdoor gyms or outdoor cinemas. Obviously, we've got dear old British weather we need to bear in mind, but I think certainly there will be, and there should be, encouragement and support from the government to ensure that our nighttime economy doesn't die, because I think we should be very proud of the measures we've made in the last few years to get it going.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. And John?
I think the issue here is about, longer term, will we see a reduction in office space and retail space, which is reallocated for residential use within city centres? And I think potentially one of the things we saw during lockdown, and to some extent now, is that people are taking their leisure activities much more locally. So, local restaurants and local bars, not necessarily in the city centres, have actually done reasonably okay at the moment. It's certainly a sort of London phenomena that the city centre is really struggling. But if we bring people back into our city centres, then I think, that will be the way that the nighttime economy recovers. It will be the people living more locally in those areas taking up the local offers, rather than necessarily people travelling into city centres. I think, the big unknowns are things like cinemas and theatres, nightclubs. How are they going to survive going forward? And that's a big question mark, and they drive some of our very big cities. And the other thing is obviously about universities, because the evening economy is often driven by university students. What's going to happen with universities? A lot of those courses are still going to be delivered online in the next academic year. Is that going to change going forward? Are we going to bring students back into our cities or not? I think that's a key part of the evening economy as well. Yeah,
the academic side is very, very important, isn't it? Interestingly, we've heard a lot recently about the 15-minute city, the Anne Hidalgo model in Paris. That will by itself encourage neighborhoods. And the question then remains, if we're going to have stronger neighborhoods, will that mean a dilution of the city center itself?
I think that the question then becomes, are we at risk of forming even worse ghettos than we have at the moment? The UK is reasonably good at not having ghettos, but we do have them. We do have areas with no facilities whatsoever. How are those areas going to survive? And, will the attention be always on the prosperous areas? So you have 15-minute cities. You can drive a long way in 15 minutes, and it depends what you mean by 15 minutes neighborhood as well. So I think there are lots of questions and marks about that. And I think it comes back to the point I think we were talking about before about offices, and you know, we're in this great debate about inclusion and diversity. You know, our neighbourhoods are not as diverse as they can be, and it's only often when we go into city centres, whether that's offices or other workplaces, do we meet a whole range of people from very different backgrounds. And if we lose that ability to meet people across a wider range of society, then I think that's a big failure of cities. That's the attraction of cities, that ability to meet people from a massive range of backgrounds.
Yes, and Katie mentioned that the social interaction, we're social animals, and we will need that all the time. Yeah. Okay, can I bring in Louise Hubbard, who has another question about trends?
Hi, yeah, thanks for fascinating discussion. I was actually going to adapt my question a little bit because I think you've partially answered it, but I just guess I'm wondering, to what extent do you think, or are there any kind of the adaptations that might come out of COVID, notably have kind of more popular support, as well as the sort of support that we might promote amongst professionals for good economic sustainable cities. Some things are potentially, some changes that we might promote are relatively contentious and have been for some time. Some maybe have got additional popular support through this time. I gave the example of walking and cycling infrastructure, but I presume there are many. I guess I was wondering whether there are any that stand out there.
Okay, who wants to take this one?
Quite happy to jump in. And so I think, you know, the big thing that has changed is the whole flexible working regime. So, you know, even though we've seen in the past a trend of sort of 4-day working in the office and 1 day at home, there was a lot of anecdotes about people saying their bosses wouldn't let them work from home and all the rest of it. And I think that's now gone. People have been able to demonstrate they can work from home. And I think we'll see a much more flexible approach to work. So, you know, back to the sort of Laila example, you know, she was going in at 7 in the morning. Maybe there will people be working who prefer to work late at night. And again, that may help drive the evening economy. So I think that flexibility of work is a big change, which will not go back. We will not go back to, you know, the 9 to 5 life had gone already to some extent, but I think it's changed even more. And I think that is the biggest fundamental change as a result of COVID on working practices.
Okay, thank you. I just want to go back to a very important point Katie made about the importance of public spaces. Jeff Haslam has actually got a good example again from New South Wales. Jeff, would you like to tell us about it? Maybe not.
By all means.
Oh, yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
We just came across this. I've only seen it once, but it's a formal arrangement whereby a cafe or restaurant can have a license to build in a car parking space. I mean, they did this one very elaborately and made it accessible, and it had sort of benches around the edge and then tables with chairs and space for a wheelchair and so forth in the parking space. And I think they boarded the floor so that it was all level with the pavement. And I think they pay a fee to the local authority to be able to do that. And it seemed a brilliant and very simple adaptation, which was sort of cost neutral to the local authority.
Yeah, in fact, that sounds very similar to a picture we saw from John's presentation as well, the conversion of car parking into outdoor sitting arrangements for restaurants, which is very encouraging. Yeah. Okay, we are fast running out of time. I'm going to leave the last word to Martina Juvara, who has another question for us or observation. Martina?
Yes. I just think another important point that we need to somehow to raise is that in the next year, at least for a year, we will live in a stop and go type mode in which lockdown will be eased and then will be closed again, and then it will be the gyms will open and then they will close again, and then And how can city systems that are not used to that, they're not that flexible, can start and stop and go? I think businesses will learn to adapt, especially if there is support like furlough and things like that. But how city systems can respond to something like this?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've got 2 minutes left. Katie and John, you've got a minute each.
Thank you. I think in terms of the sort of the planning system and how that can help potentially, obviously the government fast-tracked some legislation very quickly previously to ensure that, you know, we can have different opening hours, different delivery hours for some of the businesses to adapt to the, as you say, the stop-start of life. I think for me, in terms of the sort of return to office, it'd be interesting to understand John's view, whether the train operators, the businesses that run those companies, will start thinking about part-time season tickets, because the whole thought of pay for a season ticket, but you're only going to use it once or twice a week, you can't commit to a whole year-long season ticket. I'm intrigued to know, because obviously we're not a nationalised rail industry, you know, how we can structure that really, whether that facilitate, as you say, the stop-start of coming into cities and then abandoning them again for a few months, if indeed there is another lockdown.
Yeah, thank you. Is there anything you want to add, John?
So I think just on Katie's point and Martina's point, I think, you know, the key thing that we need to learn is how to use data much better and provide flexibility. So, you know, can we restructure the bus services very rapidly if there's another lockdown? So we're not running lots of empty buses, but we're still providing services for essential workers who need to get into work. So I think, you know, there's an opportunity there with the technology to be much more flexible. We need to be much more flexible if we do go for this stop-start economy. You know, suppliers need to be much more flexible, be able to switch from supplying restaurants to supplying shops, all these sorts of issues that we saw at the very beginning of lockdown, of shortages in some places, surpluses elsewhere. You know, that's the sort of lessons we need to learn going forward, flexibility and using data to better drive our cities.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to finish here. And I wanted to, first of all, thank Olga and Stephen for helping us set the webinar up and running it. Thank you also to all of you who have attended. I hope you have enjoyed and found it informative. But first of all, thanks to our two speakers, John and Katie, for doing a brilliant job. We are grateful. And can I leave it there and wish all of you a happy afternoon and happy weekend. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.